We can see there a symbolic gesture by members of Congress standing together to sing a song of patriotism to show that they are, in fact, standing together, united in this against this attack. To recap, 4 commercial jetliners, 2 United Airlines jets, 2 American Airlines jets, 757s, 767s, in a well-coordinated terrorist attack hijacked this morning. 2 of the jetliners crashing into the 2 twin towers in New York City. Those twin towers then collapsing about an hour later. Shortly afterwards, massive casualties are expected. It could be weeks before we know how many people might have been killed or injured in that attack. As well, another jetliner crashed into the Pentagon, and again, there we expect to hear about hundreds of casualties as well. A 4th jet crashed in the countryside in Pennsylvania. It is believed that that jet, the hijackers on board that jet, were aiming for Camp David. But as of now, the massive rescue and search efforts are going on down in New York City at the base of this island. It is complete chaos down there, as we've been able to see from our cameras on the scene. They are hoping to find survivors. As of now, so far, only a small handful. And again, rescuers have been working around the clock. Among those feared killed in this explosion, in this terrorist attack, were over 300 New York City firefighters who were in the process of trying to evacuate one of those 2 twin towers. Also, several police officers, many of the top brass of the fire department, were on the scene at the time that the towers collapsed after the jets had crashed into them, and they are feared dead as well. This is a devastating, obviously, terrorist attack. President Bush took to the airwaves a few hours ago, vowing to find who is responsible and vowing swift and strong retaliation. So once again, this is ABC News continuing coverage of the terrorist attacks on the United States. And as we've been saying, that difficult and grisly task of searching for bodies and survivors is intensifying at the site of the World Trade Center. Many of the victims are buried beneath the rubble of the twin 110-story towers. They collapsed yesterday, right after those jetliners slammed into them. Cameras did capture that horrifying moment when the second of those 2 jets crashed into the tower and burst into flames. Again, a terrible, terrible sight. Some 50,000 people normally work at the World Trade Center every day. We have no idea how many people were actually in the towers at the time of those 2 explosions that you're looking at right now. Officials say determining a final death toll could in fact take weeks. Again, at the Pentagon, still recapping, officials fear hundreds were killed when another hijacked jetliner struck there. The military is responding by putting its forces around the world on the highest state of alert. There has been no credible claim of responsibility yet for any of these attacks, but federal authorities have identified suspected terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden as a prime suspect. He has vowed to do devastation, to wreak havoc on the United States in the past, and this was clearly a stunningly well-orchestrated terrorist attack. 4 hijackings happening in the span of 2 hours, or 1 hour this morning, and many law enforcement officials still struggling to figure out how this all happened. We can go now to ABC's Josh Gerstein, who is in Washington, D.C. Josh, the President, Congress all showing a united front and vowing that business will continue and swift revenge.
Well, they certainly are vowing swift revenge and a return to normalcy, but it was anything but a normal day for President Bush. He began his day in Sarasota, Florida at an education event, a fairly routine event for the president, when he first got word of the first plane crashing into the World Trade Center. And then when the second plane went into the World Trade Center buildings, it became clear to everyone that this was no accident. This was a terrorist attack. And then, of course, word of the attack on the Pentagon and the other planes going down. The president spent the day hopscotching, going around the country, very, very unusual. He took off out of Sarasota, Florida after making a few brief remarks, flew to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, was there for some time, had a meeting, had a conference call from the general's quarters there at Barksdale Air Force Base, then got back on Air Force One under very tight security and flew on from there to Nebraska, Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, which is a base that was intended for use during the Cold War as a hideout in the event of a nuclear doomsday. He landed at Offutt Air Force Base and went into a very, very small building, which we're told allowed him to descend into an underground bunker where he held a full national security meeting with officials back here in Washington. And at that point, he then returned, flew back to Washington. His advisors very eager to get him back here to show that the government was trying to return to normal. And indeed, this evening, things returned somewhat to normal at the White House after being evacuated for most of the day. The White House staff was allowed back in, and the press was allowed back in this evening, although they have now closed the White House for the night. It's right behind me, and they've turned the lights off, but they say they will be back in business first thing in the morning.
And that is reassuring. All right, Josh Gerstein, thank you so much for that report. In a speech from the Oval Office, Mr. Bush sought to calm a country shaken by unprecedented violence. Let's listen.
Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
President Bush speaking from the Oval Office a few hours ago, seeking to calm a country obviously shaken by the worst terrorist attack suffered on U.S. soil in our country's history, vowing, in fact, to find those responsible for the attacks and bring them to justice. A fourth plane hijacked yesterday did not hit a building, as we said to you a few moments ago, but it did crash outside Pittsburgh, killing all 45 people on board. It was United Airlines Flight 93, and passenger Mark Bingham was able to call his mother on his cell phone from a locked bathroom to tell her that the plane was being hijacked. Bingham's mother, Alice Hoagland, spoke earlier with Peter Jennings.
He said, I just wanted to let you know that I love you. He was repeating that, the same thing he had told Kathy a moment before. I told him, we love you, Mark. And he said, I'm on a flight, Flight 93, United Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys that have taken over the flight, and they say they have a bomb. And I'm calling you from the airphone on the plane, meaning not his cell phone, I guess. I found out since that he was sitting in the last part of first class, and that the flight was fairly light, not very many passengers, 45 people aboard. So he may well be able to take a proactive part in that, and he intended to do and target. I certainly hope so anyway.
Ms. Hoagland, I hate interviews like this at this moment, and I'm sure you are suffering in ways that we cannot imagine. Did your son say anything else to you about the circumstances on board the flight?
No, I wasn't able to be. He was cut off. Can you hear me all right?
I can indeed.
The plane, the phone went dead after a few seconds. I got the impression that he was being distracted badly by something going on around him. I didn't hear anything except the sort of confusion. I didn't hear any explosions, any yelling, just voices, and then he seemed quite distracted about something. Quite calm voice, though. He was a very close fellow, and then he repeated that he loved us. He emphasized to me that what he was telling me was true. I told him I believed him, that we loved him, and the phone went dead.
Terrible, terrible news from the mother of Mark Bingham, one of the passengers on board one of the 4 commercial airline jets that were hijacked this morning. Several of those passengers on many of those airplanes were in fact able to use their cell phones. Many of them were reported on the phone when they called loved ones that they had been hijacked. Many of them had been herded to the back of the plane. They reported to loved ones that hijackers had in many cases attacked, stabbed flight attendants with knives that they had somehow managed to bring on board, something that is now going to be, the FBI will investigate as a tremendous security breach. That later on, in one case, the pilot of the aircraft was taken to the back of the airplane, according to some reports, but several people were able to, in those terrifying moments, when I'm sure they knew something very terrible was on its way to happening, were able to call somebody, loved ones, on their cell phone and talk with them. Well, after a day of virtual lockdown, the nation's capital does try to resume some of its normal activity today. ABC's Barry Serafin has been in Washington all evening. Barry, I know that we've already begun hearing calls for swift and severe retribution. What is the mood like on Capitol Hill among lawmakers and the White House administration?
I think the mood is the same at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, Elizabeth. It's grim, it's determined. There's certainly some simmering anger there. Congress later today is going to pass a resolution denouncing these acts, supporting the president. There's probably also going to be a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about better intelligence gathering by this country and probably about better airline security in this country.
In fact, there's been a lot of talk already on why on earth we didn't have any clue, apparently, that these attacks were going to happen. Something this well orchestrated took an enormous amount of planning and preparation by whoever is behind this attack. And there's already a lot of finger pointing going on about why we didn't get any sort of clue this was about to happen.
A lot of the intelligence professionals are saying the United States is the best in the world at technical intelligence gathering, scooping up information from the sky, in effect, but not so good nowadays in human intelligence. That is, people on the ground, informants on the ground. And I think that's going to be a lot of what you're hearing in coming days here.
And in fact, the way we fly in this country could change dramatically. Security, that sort of thing, that changes that could be happening at the airports?
Security is going to change once they resume flights, which could be as early as noon today. There's certainly, you won't be able to check in bags at curbside anymore. There's going to be a lot more security all along the way, including some random ID checks.
All right, Barry Serafin, thank you for checking in with us from our nation's capital, recapping the very latest on this unprecedented terrorist attack on the United States. A massive and grim search for survivors and bodies is underway in New York City after two hijacked jetliners, one an American Airlines jet, the other a United Airlines jet, slammed into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. The fires set off by the crashes eventually caused both of the 110-story towers to collapse. Officials fear as many as 300 firefighters may be among the casualties. They were apparently on the scene after the first jetliner crashed into the first tower, trying to evacuate people who are working in those buildings. And because they were there going in to rescue and to help people out, they too might have been victimized when the second jetliner crashed into, and then the second tower, and then when both towers eventually collapsed. But they say establishing a final death toll in this disaster at the World Trade Center location could take weeks. In the meantime, at the Pentagon, investigators fear hundreds of people were killed when another hijacked jetliner slammed into that building. The military is responding by putting its forces around the world on the very highest alert, and an aircraft carrier due to come home from the Persian Gulf has been ordered to remain in that area indefinitely. Obviously, the speculation being if there is any sort of retribution, any retaliation when we figure out who is behind the attack, perhaps that vessel will be in place for that. In an address from the Oval Office, President Bush said thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. He vowed to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. Indeed, we are already hearing quite a bit of talk from many people on Capitol Hill. Peter Jennings earlier this evening interviewing former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger, vowing swift revenge, said this is war, it's been an act of war, you respond to war swiftly and severely. Here's some of what's happening around the country today. Congress and federal offices in the nation's capital will, in fact, be open this morning, as we've been hearing from our reporters on the scene, even as the Pentagon is on fire and the search for victims goes on. The Pentagon will, in fact, be open for business. However, the stock markets will be closed and there will only be limited postal deliveries nationwide. Schools in both Washington and New York City have canceled classes for today, and all airline flights remain canceled until at least noon Eastern time. The FAA apparently shutting everything down once it became clear that there was this orchestrated terrorist attack happening involving 4 hijacked jetliners, all in the span of about an hour yesterday morning, shutting down, something it's never done, shutting down the entire country's airspace. For anyone seeking information on family members who may have been victims, a hotline has been set up. That number is 1-800-331 0075. You can call that to find out if anybody you know or care about is involved in this attack. And if you have any information on terrorist activity, you can go to the website set up by the FBI. That website is www.ifccfbi.com. You see that website, .gov, pardon me. www.ifccfbi.gov is the website the FBI has set up. We're going to go now to ABC's Bill Blakemore, who's been very close to ground zero for most of the evening down in lower Manhattan, where the devastation has been amazing. Rescue crews are working in impossible conditions trying to find survivors. Bill, any update, any more survivors found?
Not that we know of so far. The big problem is an enormous amount of dust and the fact that they still cannot get the fires out. We can see against the dark night sky the smoke coming from two of the large buildings that are just to the west of the trade towers. They've been burning all day. We were watching them burn from before noon today. They've tried to get up into the buildings next to them to get streams of water onto them. But they're still having an awful lot of trouble with that heat, and the heat also in the very center of the base of where the two trade towers were. You can probably see some of the smoke down at the end of the street, very often obscuring what little of the wreckage we can see from here, the twisted wreckage. But the search and rescue operations are beginning to move around the periphery. We're beginning to see some of the rubble moved out by front-end loaders in some of the trucks. And every couple of hours, another shift of firemen comes past us, completely covered with dust.
And Bill, how quickly was the city and the National Guard, I'm assuming or supposing, how quickly were they able to get all of those bulldozers and backhoes that are so necessary to move this massive amount of wreckage?
We saw that all accumulating by late afternoon. I haven't myself seen any of the National Guard yet, but by late afternoon there were dozens of fire trucks, these enormous pieces of heavy machinery like the front-end loaders coming on trailers, some of them. They were all in position here in these side streets out behind where the trade towers stood not so long ago. And at first there was a bit of traffic jam out here and real gridlock as the men in charge of coordinating all of this effort tried to figure out how to get things into position. But that's all been cleared up pretty much now. They closed down the city completely. There's also no electricity here except for the floodlights they brought in. But there's certainly no civilian traffic here, so they finally have that under control. Of course, there's a very grim job ahead.
A grim job indeed, and it could be weeks. Thank you, Bill Blakemore, for that report down from lower Manhattan near ground zero of this disaster near the World Trade Center Twin Towers where they once stood. They say it could be weeks before we know the extent of the casualties, the extent of how many people killed and injured. The Navy's Atlantic Fleet has sent aircraft carriers, guided missile cruisers, and destroyers into the waters off New York City and Washington, D.C. The Navy has also deployed a warship to patrol off the coast of Seattle. ABC's Neil Karlinski is there.
In Seattle, a Navy frigate armed with anti-aircraft weapons steamed into position near downtown in Elliott Bay. Throughout this city, life as normal simply stopped.
They came on and said that they were evacuating and please leave immediately.
Downtown, several buildings were evacuated. Even the city's famous Space Needle was closed indefinitely.